November 24th, 1326. Hereford, England. The marketplace seethes with humanity. Nobles draped in fur, stern-faced clergy, hawk-eyed merchants, and curious peasants all jostling for a glimpse of what promises to be a gruesome spectacle. At the heart of the square, towering above the crowd like a grim stage, stands a wooden scaffold. Upon it soldiers drag forth a man in his early 40s. His cheeks are sunken, his skin deathly pale from days of deliberate starvation, his once opulent garments hang in tatters, soiled and clinging to a frame more ghost than man. Not long ago he wielded immense power, second only to the king himself. Today that power crumbles beneath the jeers of the masses. The punishment awaiting him is so savage it will sear itself into history. His name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, trusted advisor, rumored lover of King Edward II, and by day's end, he will be no more than a cautionary tale whispered for generations. Within mere hours, his mangled corpse will hang as a grisly warning, proof of the peril that awaits those who climb too high and cross the wrong enemies. But Hugh Despenser's gruesome fate didn't happen in a vacuum. To truly grasp how he fell from the pinnacle of power to the depths of infamy, we must journey back in time, into a shadowy era where ambition knew no bounds, alliances were as fragile as whispers, and betrayal lurked behind every velvet curtain. This is the tangled tale of lust, loyalty, and lethal politics that shaped 14th century England, and ultimately sealed Hugh Despenser's doom. Hugh Despenser was born around 1286, the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder and Isabel Beauchamp, daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick. With noble blood coursing through his veins and ties to some of England's most influential families, young Hugh entered the world with every advantage. His father, a steadfast ally of King Edward the Fern, had already carved out a position of wealth, prestige, and royal favor, setting the stage for his son to inherit not just a name but a legacy. From an early age, Hugh was groomed for power. He was taught to serve the crown with unwavering loyalty and to seize every chance to elevate the Despenser dynasty. That chance arrived in 1307, when Edward II took the throne. The new king was no stranger to controversy. His court was already ablaze with whispers about his intimate relationship with his first favorite, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston's brazen arrogance and open disdain for the nobility had scandalized England, casting a long shadow that would later fall on Hugh Despenser himself. When Piers Gaveston was savagely murdered by rebellious barons in 1312, the heart of King Edward II's inner circle was left hollow, and Hugh Despenser saw his moment. Ruthless and calculating, he moved swiftly to fill the void. By 1316, he had maneuvered his way into the king's favor, securing the coveted role of royal chamberlain, a post that offered not only prestige but intimate daily access to the monarch himself. But Hugh wasn't relying on charm alone. He solidified his grip on power through a shrewd marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's own niece. With her came not only royal blood but also the vast and prosperous lordship of Glamorgan, in Wales. As his bond with Edward II deepened, Hugh's influence exploded. No longer just a trusted advisor, he became a force of unchecked ambition, driven by a hunger for land, titles, and wealth that seemed to know no limit. With the king firmly under his sway, Hugh Despenser bent the laws of England to serve his own ambition. He orchestrated legal schemes to seize lands from rival nobles and even preyed on the vulnerable, ruthlessly stripping estates from widows, including his own sister-in-law, whom he coerced into surrendering valuable property. His greed knew no bounds. In 1321, when a baronial uprising forced his exile, Hugh didn't retreat quietly. Instead, he turned to piracy, brazenly attacking English merchant ships, a shocking betrayal that laid bare his utter contempt for law. and loyalty alike. But exile didn't last long. When Edward II crushed the rebellion and reasserted control, Hugh returned not as a humbled man, but as a tyrant reborn. Between 1322 and 1326, the Despensers, father and son, became the undisputed power behind the throne. Hugh the Younger controlled royal access like a gatekeeper, manipulated the kingdom's finances to his advantage, and ruled over swaths of land with an iron grip. He didn't just influence the crown, he was the crown in all but name. The medieval chronicler Jean Froissart didn't mince words. He claimed Hugh Despenser was the true ruler of England, king in all but name. But it wasn't just Despenser's political dominance that stirred unrest. It was the scandalous whispers surrounding his relationship with Edward II. Despite being married and fathering several children, rumors swirled through the royal court that Hugh shared more than just counsel with the king. Whispers became accusations. Chroniclers of the era branded him a sodomite, a damning label in medieval society, where such a relationship was not only a grievous sin in the eyes of the church, but a direct affront to both the natural and divine order. Few were more incensed by his influence than Queen Isabella, Edward's own wife and the proud daughter of the King of France. To her, Hugh Despenser was not only a political usurper but a personal insult, one that she would neither forgive nor forget. Publicly humiliated by her husband's blatant favoritism toward Hugh Despenser, Queen Isabella watched in silent fury as her influence at court crumbled. Her authority, her wealth, even access to her own children, were systematically stripped away under Hugh's tightening grip. By 1324, Despenser had gone so far as to confiscate the Queen's lands and imprison members of her personal household, treating the consort of the king as little more than an enemy of the state. The final blow came when her children were forcibly taken from her care and placed under the watch of Hugh's wife, an unforgivable insult that turned Isabella's simmering resentment into burning rage. But fate soon offered her an escape and a weapon. In 1325, she was sent to France to broker a peace treaty. There, in the heart of her homeland, Isabella found an unlikely ally. Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman who had once languished in the Tower of London for opposing the Despensers before escaping into exile. Together they would ignite a rebellion that would shake the English crown to its core. Roger Mortimer became more than just Queen Isabella's ally. He became her lover and co-conspirator in a bold plot to topple Edward II and his despised favorite, Hugh Despenser. In September 1326, the pair launched their daring invasion of England, leading a modest force of mercenaries across the Channel. What stunned the king and the Despensers wasn't the size of the invading army. It was how quickly the tide turned against them. Decades of cruelty, greed, and abuse had sown deep resentment across the realm. As Isabella and Mortimer advanced, noble after noble rallied to their cause, eager to rid the kingdom of the corrupt power behind the throne. Edward II and the Despensers, sensing the ground shift beneath their feet, fled westward in desperation, dragging with them a hefty share of the royal treasury. But their flight was doomed. Pursued and cornered, the conspirators were split apart. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured in Bristol, and justice, swift and merciless, was delivered. He was executed on the spot in a gruesome display that marked the beginning of the end for the once untouchable Despenser dynasty. On October 27, 1326, Hugh Despenser the Elder met a savage end. Still clad in his armor, he was hauled before a jeering crowd and hanged like a common criminal. But death by noose was only the beginning. His lifeless body was beheaded, hacked into quarters, and cast to the dogs, an unceremonious fate for a man who had once stood proudly at the heart of royal power. While his remains were scattered, his son and King Edward II continued their frantic escape across the harsh Welsh landscape. Hunted and abandoned by nearly all their allies, the once mighty pair stumbled through the countryside, desperate and alone. Their flight came to a bitter end near Neath, where they were finally captured, broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated. By mid-November, Edward II was dragged into captivity, stripped of power and forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. But for Hugh Despenser the Younger, an even darker fate loomed. Knowing mercy was impossible, he tried to take his own life through starvation. But even this desperate act failed. On November 24th, Hugh was hauled before a tribunal dominated by his fiercest enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and the I.D. Lancastrian barons, those who had long suffered under his ruthless extortion. The trial was little more than a brutal formality, a staged spectacle to legitimize what everyone knew was inevitable. Charged with treason, theft, corruption, and manipulation of the king, Hugh faced an overwhelming list of accusations. The tribunal meticulously wrapped the proceedings in legal guise to mask its thirst for vengeance. But from the moment he stepped into the courtroom, his fate was sealed. Guilty on all counts, Hugh Despenser was condemned to suffer one of the most gruesome executions ever recorded in English history. On the grim morning of November 24th, Hugh Despenser was dragged to the bustling marketplace of Hereford, where a massive crowd had gathered, nobles, commoners, and the very architects of his downfall, Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and the triumphant barons. What unfolded was a merciless spectacle of public vengeance, designed to shatter not just his body, but his legacy. Bound tightly to a towering ladder, Hugh was forced to face the jeering masses as every agonizing moment played out in full view. A cruel crown of stinging nettles was pressed onto his head, a savage mockery of the royal crown he had once shared with King Edward. His flesh became a canvas for humiliation, as biblical verses condemning pride and wickedness were seared into his skin. Then came the true horror. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the executioners tore off Hugh's genitals and consigned them to flames right before his eyes, an excruciating act meant to strip away his power and dignity in the most brutal way imaginable. This horrific punishment was deliberately chosen to exact vengeance for his alleged sodomitical sins. While still conscious, Hugh's abdomen was gruesomely cut open, and his entrails were painstakingly pulled out and set ablaze before the horrified crowd. Witnesses later recounted a chilling, unnatural howl that tore through the marketplace, a sound of agony that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it, fueling the twisted delight of the spectators. Only after this unbearable torment was Hugh finally hanged. But even death did not spare him from disgrace. His body was beheaded, then quartered, each piece sent to different cities across the kingdom, as a brutal warning. His severed head was impaled atop a stake at the gates of London, a grisly monument to the fate awaiting anyone who dared to abuse the crown's power. The savage cruelty of Hugh Despenser's execution was no accident. It served multiple deliberate purposes. On one level, it was raw revenge for the ruthless greed and cruelty he had wielded during his rise to power. But deeper still, it was a symbolic cleansing, a brutal attempt to purge the pollution many believed he had spread throughout the Beau kingdom, corrupting the throne through his toxic influence over Edward II and the scandalous whispers of their forbidden relationship. The public castration was a pointed and merciless condemnation of this alleged sexual transgression, meant to disgrace him in the eyes of all. Yet, even in death, the wounds ran deep. 4 years later, in December 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, was finally granted permission to gather what remained of his shattered body and lay him to rest on the family estate in Gloucestershire. But of the man who once wielded such power, only a head, A femur and a few scattered fragments could be recovered. His legacy reduced to mere pieces, scattered by the storm of history. An utterly undignified end for a man who had once stood as the second most powerful figure in England. Edward II's fate was equally dark and tragic. Held captive after his forced abdication, he met his mysterious and grisly death in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. The most infamous and haunting legend surrounding his demise tells of a red-hot poker, brutally inserted into his body, a method cruelly devised to leave no external wounds yet deliver excruciating, silent torment. Though some modern historians debate the truth of this tale, its chilling symbolism is undeniable. It served as a final, twisted echo of the accusations against him, punishment steeped in macabre poetic justice, mirroring the savage fate of Hugh Despenser. The reign of Edward II and the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of Hugh Despenser mark one of the darkest and most turbulent chapters in medieval English history, a story of power, betrayal, and ruthless retribution that still captivates centuries later. For centuries, the story of Edward II and Hugh Despenser was filtered through the harsh lens of homophobia and moral judgment. Edward was cast as a weak and ineffective king, a ruler undone by his personal desires, while Hugh was painted as a sinister puppet master, an unscrupulous schemer who preyed on the king's weaknesses to amass power and wealth. But modern historians have peeled back these layers of bias to reveal a far more complex truth. Yes, Hugh Despenser was a ruthless and greedy politician whose relentless ambition alienated nearly every noble in England. Yet many of the lurid tales about his intimate relationship with Edward are now seen as politically motivated smears, accusations of sodomy wielded as a weapon to destroy reputations and justify rebellion. This more nuanced understanding invites us to reconsider not only the men themselves, but the brutal, unforgiving world of medieval politics they inhabited. Whatever the truth of their personal bond, Hugh Despenser's tragic fate starkly reveals the volatile crossroads of power, sexuality, and politics in medieval England. His brutal torture and dismemberment were more than mere punishment. They were a visceral, gruesome warning to anyone daring to defy social norms or amass enemies. In the ruthless game of royal influence, Hugh's execution was far from a simple legal proceeding. It was a meticulously staged spectacle, designed to broadcast a powerful political and moral message to the kingdom. Every element, from his public castration to the mutilation of his body, carried heavy symbolism, condemning sexual transgression, exposing political corruption, and signaling the restoration of order to a fractured society. His rise and fall was as spectacular as it was swift. From a relatively obscure knight, Hugh soared to become the kingdom's most feared and powerful man, only to end shattered and quartered, his remains sent to the far corners of England as a grim testament to the fragility of power. His story remains one of medieval history's most dramatic illustrations of how fortunes can rise and collapse with staggering speed. In a bitter twist of fate, the regime that toppled Edward II and orchestrated Hugh Despenser's grisly execution proved no more enduring. Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, the very men who had overseen Hugh's brutal downfall, would themselves be swept from power just 4 years later, as the young Edward III seized control. Mortimer met a grim end like Hugh's, condemned and hanged as a traitor, though spared the gruesome tortures. The relentless wheel of medieval politics had turned once again, swallowing its own champions. Nearly 700 years on, Hugh Despenser's story still captivates and unsettles. In a recent survey, he was named the greatest British villain of the 14th century, and even ranked among the worst Britons in history. His life and death have inspired countless plays, novels, and television dramas, portraying him as the quintessential, corrupt manipulator the dark heart of one of England's most turbulent eras. Today, when we look back on Hugh Despenser's brutal execution, it's impossible not to recoil in horror at the sheer savagery of the medieval justice system, a detour world where cruelty was not just punishment but spectacle, designed to instill fear and maintain control. Yet, beyond the shock of his grisly fate, Hugh's story holds a deeper, more unsettling lesson. It reminds us that the dangerous entanglements of power, favoritism, and the abuse of privilege are not relics of a distant era, but persistent forces that continue to shape human societies today. This king's favorite, castrated, tortured, and publicly hanged, stands as a haunting symbol, a stark mirror reflecting the enduring complexities of power's relationship with sexuality, greed, and justice. His downfall echoes through time, urging us to question how those in positions of influence can manipulate systems for personal gain, how societies punish those who disrupt accepted norms, and how the struggle for justice remains a fragile and often brutal contest. In many ways, Hugh Despenser's life and death challenge us to confront the darker undercurrents that run beneath the surface of governance and human relationships, reminding us that the interplay between power and morality is as relevant now as it was 7 centuries ago. Today, when we look back on Hugh Despenser's brutal execution, it's impossible not to recoil in horror at the sheer savagery of the medieval justice system, a world where cruelty was not just punishment, but spectacle, designed to instill fear and maintain control. Yet, beyond the shock of his grisly fate, Hugh's story holds a deeper, more unsettling lesson. It reminds us that the dangerous entanglements of power, favoritism, and the abuse of privilege are not relics of a distant era, but persistent forces that continue to shape human societies today. This king's favorite, castrated, tortured, and publicly hanged, stands as a haunting symbol, a stark mirror reflecting the enduring complexities of power's relationship with sexuality, greed, and justice. His downfall echoes through time, urging us to question how those in positions of influence can manipulate systems for personal gain, how societies punish those who disrupt accepted norms, and how the struggle for justice remains a fragile and often brutal contest. In many ways, Hugh Despenser's life and death challenge us to confront the darker undercurrents that run beneath the surface of governance and human relationships, reminding us that the interplay between power and morality is as relevant now as it was 7 centuries ago. It is up to us today to learn from these brutal chapters of history, to recognize the warning signs of corruption and injustice, to hold power accountable, and to build a society where justice is not a spectacle of cruelty, but a true protector of fairness and dignity for all. The past may be distant, but its lessons are urgent and vital.